Hey folks, David Stewart here. Did normies ruin comics? This is a comment I've gotten numerous times on my last few videos on the culture war, specifically how do we evangelize the normies? And I've gotten lots of pushback to my ideas on that particular video, which is fine. But this particular one I really wanted to shoot back on because I think it's the opposite. I don't think that normal or mainstream people ruined comics at all. I actually think it was the opposite. Comics were taken out of the mainstream, and I'd like to explain my conclusion to that. Before I do so, let me make a distinction between what I'm talking about. So if you have a small dedicated subculture and then you have an influx of normal people to it that makes it explode in popularity, obviously that's going to fundamentally alter the subculture, often in ways that the creators of the subculture don't want it to be altered. It's going to dilute some of the things that made it special. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about in this is the reality that comic books used to be more popular than they are. And the mainstream interest for them was removed because the product was changed. And I'd like to read a little bit of a quote for you that supports my point of view and distills down this idea that comics were taken away from the normies, not ruined by the normies. So this is an interview with Jim Shooter, who was in charge of Marvel for about 10 years in the 1980s. And his basic thesis about the problem with modern comics boils down to storytelling, that they don't tell good stories that people are interested in. That's the background to this quote. Let me read it. It takes forever to tell a story. He's talking about what he calls decompressed storytelling. It's like a soap opera. It takes forever to tell a story. What Stan Lee would put in 6 pages, it takes 6 months. So you look at the sales. Marvel comics are now $4 a piece, and they're thrilled if the sales are over 30,000. When I was at Marvel, the whole world was different. We didn't have a single title. We had 75 titles. We didn't have a single one that sold below 100,000. We had the X-Men approaching 750,000, and that's not some special number 1 or somebody dies or changes costumes or someone gets married. It was every time. A lot of it was single copy readers. People weren't running around buying cases of it because it had a foil embossed cover. It was every issue. So with that quote, you basically have my thesis, which is that comics at one point in time were extremely mainstream. I remember as a kid seeing comic books on the shelf at the drugstore, like in the 1980s. In fact, I remember buying Ninja Turtle comics off of the shelf and reading them, not going to a comic book store. I didn't set foot in a comic book store until like the 1990s. And it was kind of a weird thing when comic book stores became the place where you had to buy comics. So at one point in time, these things were really mainstream, and they've gone away from being mainstream and actually been captured and become a subculture. So it's really like a subculture captured the industry and started excluding all of the things which make the comics appealing to the mainstream. Jim Shooter's thesis is that it comes down to storytelling. Modern storytelling in comics is very soap opera-y and not about communicating a good story in an efficient way that people like to read. You could go on and on about this. It's been covered probably by creators who are far more into comics than I am, but that's the basic idea here. So how could normies have ruined something which they were a part of? Comics were very mainstream. So if you're making comics now for the mainstream, you would think that they would be more popular than they are. So I don't think that works. I don't think they're making comics for the mainstream. Is it that normal people ended up being in charge of comics and that's what made them bad? No, I don't think so either, because they would make comics like those which they liked, not comics which are completely different from what appealed to the mainstream. What I think ended up happening is, starting in the 1990s, you had a capture of the industry by geeks. I think it went in reverse. Normally you have a subculture that it becomes very hip and cool and attracts lots of people and blows up. This, I think, was the opposite. You had something which was very cool, or something which was very mainstream, and it became something cool. It became a small, isolated subculture. So I think it was captured by creators who wanted to make fundamentally different products. They cared more about the art than the storytelling. This is something Jim Shooter mentions in an interview, which I'll link either in the description box, or probably in the description box and maybe in a pinned comment so you can respond to it directly. That the art's very beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily tell a story well. And also he talks about how his comics, once he kind of got the routine figured out at Marvel, they always shipped on time. And that's not necessarily the case now. So this beautiful art may be good for selling at a convention, but it's not necessarily good for telling a story efficiently. So you have an emphasis on the art, you have an emphasis on certain parts of the style, certain elements of soap opera-like storytelling rather than telling plot-intensive stories that are very interesting to people and could be understood in some portion within a single issue. You have to buy all 6 issues. And I think as that has happened, the business side is focused more on this subculture and trying to extract as much money as possible out of this small reader base rather than selling to a really, really big reader base. So that's why you have all these variant covers, 15 different variant covers for, actually I think there were 20 for Batman 50, the one where he gets married or is supposed to get married to Catwoman. 20 different variant covers. That means collectors who are really into Batman comics will buy 20 of the same book, even though they don't get any benefit from those extra 19 copies in terms of story or anything like that. So you're trying to milk a smaller and smaller number of people. And indeed, there are many businesses that I think unfortunately have fallen into this over the last really couple of decades, which is trying to heavily monetize a smaller number of people, trying to hit that long tail a little bit harder rather than making something that's really has a lot of mainstream appeal to make your money. So that's what I think happened. And now if you look at what's happened more recently, the last 10 or 20 years, the capture of Marvel and DC by social justice warriors or, say, left-leaning artists, that has to do more with cultural entryism, not normies. So cultural entryism is a term that I became familiar with because of an author named Alexander Adams, and I saw it in an interview with him, actually, where he's talking about a book he wrote called Culture War that specifically talks about comics in it. Cultural entryism is entering into this subculture with the intent to use it and change it, and thus excluding the people that originally enjoyed that subculture. So I don't believe the SJWs are normies at all. And in fact, the more time you spend in the real world with normal people who I've mentioned don't really care that much about the culture war, the more you realize that writing a story about feminist perspectives or feminist ideology is ridiculous because normal people aren't interested in that. They're not particularly interested in the other side either, but they're definitely not interested in feminist stories, which is why they don't buy them, right? Which is why they continue to sell even less copies. So I don't think what you see with the comics industry now is the result of mainstream appeal at all. In fact, you should see way more comics being sold. You have billion-dollar movie franchises in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Extended Universe on screen that should be causing people to go and buy the books in droves and you should be gangbusters selling comics right now, but it's not. And that's ultimately because the product no longer appeals to anyone in the mainstream. It's been completely changed from how it was in the 70s and 80s. And maybe I can do some more content in the future. I'll have some comic book artists on to talk a little bit about some of the things that they've seen that have changed. But I think the numbers don't lie. When you have sales of 750,000 go down to 30,000, you have a significant loss of mainstream appeal, not an influx of mainstream readers that have fundamentally altered it. You can also see this in other things as well, whether it's certain kinds of video games like World of Warcraft, where there's been a massive decline in the number of subscribers. It's not because they're appealing to the mainstream, otherwise they'd have more subscribers, not less. It's because they're appealing to different subparts of what the broad spectrum of people were originally attracted to in the game. Now, I think there's a little bit of a counter thing here that I just want to mention at the end, which is when you have a franchise or you have a subculture that allows for a high degree of entry into it, high degree of variability as far as how into it you are, I think you have something that's more robust than what we've seen comics, evolve into, something that's very small. So if you look at Star Wars as an example, Star Wars of yore, the movies had great mass appeal. Everybody liked that first Star Wars movie. Most people like most Star Wars movies. Star Wars is an enjoyable experience. It's a cultural event usually, or at least it was, back when it was Lucas's pet. But then there's deeper levels. People can read the novels, people buy the toys, and so you have a broad appeal that also goes into the very, very narrow and highly profitable geek, if you will, the person who's really into it, that's able to buy and be very interested in a wide number of things that have to do with Star Wars. There's other things as well that are like that, but Star Wars is a great example. Just because something has a strong geek element to it somewhere in that tail doesn't mean it can't also have wide appeal. Those things are not mutually exclusive, and they don't need to be mutually exclusive, and that's one last point I want to throw in there at the end. But no, I don't think Normies ruined comics. Rather, I think comics were taken away from the Normies, and that's part of the problem with them. Thanks so much for watching this particular video. Leave me your comments down below, especially if you are an avid comic reader. My newest book is Voices of the Void. This is what the physical version looks like here. You can get it in paperback. It's another one of these little paperbacks. Should take about 2 hours to read. It's a 90-page book. My other previous one, so I did 2 of these this year just to try them out. Crown of Sight, this is high fantasy. This one is sci-fi horror. So if you like the movie Aliens or you like H.P. Lovecraft, that's kind of what are the 2 big influences on this one. It's kind of Lovecraft meets Aliens. This is more like, I don't know, kind of dark fantasy, but somewhat influenced by Tolkien. Maybe it's, I don't know quite what to describe this. I'll come up with a better log line for the next video. But you can buy these. They're both 99 cents in ebook format, or you can buy the paperback for a few dollars. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.